The day my husband packed 2 suitcases and told me our marriage was finished, I was 8 months pregnant, standing barefoot on the kitchen tiles with his abandoned coffee mug still warm in my hands, and the last thing he said to me before he closed the door was that he had finally found a woman worthy of the life he deserved. I did not know, standing there with our unborn child kicking beneath my ribs, that within a matter of months the truth would turn his entire world upside down, and that the woman he left me for was not who she claimed to be at all. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet strength of second chances, I want to invite you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one matter to our community, and every single one of you who joins us here makes this a place where broken hearts can find a little light. Now let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Clara Whitmore, and for most of my life I believed I was simply an ordinary woman with an ordinary story. I grew up in a small brick house on the edge of a quiet town, raised by my grandmother, Eleanor, after my parents died in a car accident when I was only 6 years old. I have almost no memory of my mother's face except in photographs, and even less of my father's voice, but I remember my grandmother's hands perfectly, rough and warm, always smelling faintly of lavender soap and the bread she baked every Sunday morning. She never spoke much about my parents, and whenever I asked questions about them, a shadow would pass over her eyes, and she would gently change the subject, telling me that some doors were better left closed until the right time came to open them. I did not understand then how much truth was hidden behind those words. I met Nathaniel Cole when I was 24, working as an assistant editor at a small publishing house in the city, the kind of job that paid just enough to cover rent and little else, but which I loved with my whole heart because I got to spend my days surrounded by stories. Nathaniel was an ambitious young architect back then, full of dreams about the buildings he wanted to design, the skyline he wanted to leave his mark on. He was charming in the way that confident men often are, quick with a joke, quicker with a compliment, and he had a way of looking at me that made me feel like the only person in the room. We fell in love the way young people often do, quickly and completely, convinced that our love alone would be enough to carry us through anything life threw at us. We married 2 years later in a small garden ceremony with folding chairs and paper lanterns, because neither of us had much money, and I remember thinking, as I walked down that makeshift aisle toward him, that I had never been happier in my entire life. The early years of our marriage were not easy, but they were, in their own way, beautiful. We lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, where the hum of the dryers downstairs would lull us to sleep at night. Nathaniel worked long hours at a mid-sized architecture firm, slowly climbing the ladder, while I continued editing manuscripts and took on freelance work on the side to help make ends meet. We ate dinner some nights that consisted of nothing more than toast and eggs, and we would laugh about it, promising each other that one day things would be different, that one day we would look back on those lean years fondly. I believed him completely. I believed in us completely. There is a particular kind of faith that young love carries, an unshakable certainty that whatever hardships come, they are temporary, and that the person beside you will always remain constant. I did not yet know how fragile that kind of faith could be when tested against ambition and vanity. Everything began to shift about 4 years into our marriage, around the time Nathaniel was promoted to a senior position at his firm and began working directly with wealthier clients, the kind of people who owned penthouses and vacation homes and spoke casually about investments the way other people spoke about the weather. I watched him change slowly, the way water wears down stone, so gradually that I almost did not notice until the shape of him was already different. He started dressing more sharply, buying watches we could not really afford, speaking with a new kind of restlessness about the life he felt he deserved. He would come home from meetings with these clients and describe their homes in detail, the marble floors, the private wine cellars, the way they spoke about the world as though it existed simply for their convenience, and there was a hunger in his voice when he talked about it that unsettled me, though I told myself it was simply ambition, simply a man wanting more for his family. I got pregnant during our 6th year of marriage, and I remember the joy on Nathaniel's face when I told him how he had lifted me off the ground and spun me around our small kitchen, promising that everything was about to change for the better. For a while, it seemed as though it might. He threw himself into work with renewed energy, telling me he wanted to give our child everything he never had growing up, and I believed that his hunger for success was, at its core, an act of love for the family we were building. I did not yet understand that somewhere along the way, his definition of what our family deserved had begun to include things I could never give him, no matter how much I loved him. It was during my 7th month of pregnancy that Vivian Ashcombe walked into his firm as a new client, and everything I thought I knew about my marriage began to quietly unravel. Nathaniel came home that first evening talking about her the way he talked about none of his other clients, with a kind of breathless admiration that made my stomach tighten even before I understood why. She was, according to him, the heiress to the Ashcombe shipping fortune, a woman who had grown up between London and Monaco, who spoke 3 languages and had attended the kind of boarding schools whose names alone seemed to open doors. She had hired his firm to design a coastal estate, and Nathaniel described the project with a kind of reverence I had not heard in his voice in years, not even when he talked about our own child growing inside me. I want to be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering in a story like this one. I was not naive. I noticed the way his phone began buzzing more often, the way he started staying later at the office, the way he began speaking to me with a kind of distracted politeness, as though I were a task on his list rather than his wife. I asked him about it once, sitting across from him at our small kitchen table, my hands resting on the swell of my belly, and he told me I was being paranoid, that pregnancy was making me insecure, that Vivian was simply a client and nothing more. I wanted so badly to believe him that I let the doubt sink back down beneath the surface of my heart, telling myself that the man who had once spun me around our kitchen in joy could not possibly be capable of betraying me now, not when I was carrying his child, not when we had built an entire life together out of nothing. The truth came apart in pieces, the way these things often do. A friend of mine, Margaret, who worked at a cafe near Nathaniel's office, mentioned one afternoon that she had seen him there with a woman who was not me, their heads bent close together over coffee, his hand resting on top of hers in a way that friends and clients simply did not touch. I did not confront him immediately. Instead, I found myself watching him more closely, noticing the way he had started working out again after years of neglecting the gym, the way he had bought a new cologne, the way he had begun speaking about our future in vague, uncertain terms instead of the concrete plans we used to make together. I was 8 months pregnant, exhausted, frightened, and increasingly certain that the man I loved was slipping away from me for reasons I did not yet fully understand. The confrontation, when it finally came, happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, sunlight pouring through our kitchen window, the kind of golden light that makes even difficult moments feel strangely cinematic. I had made tea for both of us, an old habit from earlier, gentler years, and I asked him directly if he was seeing someone else. I watched something shift behind his eyes, some final wall crumbling, and he did not deny it. Instead, he told me, with a calmness that frightened me more than anger would have, that he had fallen in love with Vivian, that she represented a life he had always dreamed of and never believed he could have, that staying with me now would mean settling for less than what he felt he deserved. He said the words as though they were simply facts, as though the 8 years of our marriage, the sacrifices we had made for each other, the child growing beneath my heart, could be weighed against a woman's inherited fortune and found wanting. I remember very little about the physical sensation of that moment, only that I felt something inside me go very still and very quiet, the way the air goes still before a storm. I did not scream. I did not beg him to stay. Some instinct in me, some quiet dignity I did not know I possessed until that moment, refused to let me plead for a love that had already decided I was not enough. I simply asked him to leave, and he did, packing 2 suitcases with the efficiency of a man who had clearly been planning this departure for some time, and as he walked out our front door for the last time, I stood in the kitchen with his abandoned coffee mug still warm in my hands, 8 months pregnant, utterly alone, and I understood in that moment that whatever life I had imagined for myself was about to change in ways I could not yet comprehend. The weeks that followed were among the hardest of my life. I want to speak honestly about about grief, because I think too often we sanitize it in stories, make it neat and quick, when in truth grief is messy and slow and comes in waves that knock you down when you least expect them. I would find myself crying in the grocery store over something as small as a display of baby clothes, or sitting in my car outside our apartment, unable to make myself go inside to the silence that now filled it. My grandmother had passed away 2 years earlier, and I felt her absence more acutely than ever during those weeks, wishing desperately for her steady hands and her quiet wisdom to guide me through what felt like an impossible darkness. My brother, Oliver, who lived several hours away, began calling me every single day, checking in, reminding me gently that I was not as alone as I felt, and my dear friend Margaret took to showing up at my apartment several evenings a week with groceries and takeout, sitting with me in comfortable silence when I did not have the strength for conversation. Financially, things grew difficult almost immediately. Nathaniel had always handled our joint finances, and in the chaos of the separation, I discovered that several of our accounts had been drained more significantly than I realized, funneled, I would later learn, into expensive gifts for Vivian and deposits toward the coastal property he had been designing for her, a property he apparently intended to share with her once their relationship became more permanent. I took on additional freelance editing work despite my exhaustion, determined not to lean too heavily on my brother's generosity, though he insisted repeatedly that I let him help. I remember lying awake at night, one hand resting on my belly, feeling my daughter move within me, and making a quiet promise that no matter what happened, no matter how frightened I felt, I would build a life for her filled with more stability and more love than fear. It was during this time, about 3 weeks before my due date, that I received an unexpected phone call from a law firm I had never heard of, requesting that I come in for what they described only as a matter concerning my late grandmother's estate. I assumed, given how little my grandmother had owned in material terms, that this was simply some final piece of paperwork, perhaps related to the small house she had left me, which I had already sold 2 years earlier to help cover expenses during a difficult stretch in our marriage. I nearly did not go, exhausted as I was, but something in the formality of the letter that followed the phone call, something in the careful, deliberate language of it, convinced me to make the appointment. The law office was quiet and dignified, tucked into an older building downtown, and I was greeted by a silver-haired attorney named Mr. Harrington, who spoke to me with a gentleness that immediately put me slightly at ease despite my nerves. He explained, as I sat across from him with my hands folded protectively over my belly, that my grandmother had not simply been a modest woman who baked bread on Sundays and lived quietly in a small brick house. My grandmother, it turned out, had been born into the Ashworth family, one of the founding families behind a shipping and logistics empire that had grown over the decades into one of the largest privately held companies in the country, an empire that, through a complicated and painful history involving a bitter feud with a business rival following my grandfather's sudden death, had been placed into a carefully guarded trust decades earlier, hidden from public record specifically to protect my grandmother and, eventually, me, from certain individuals who had once tried to seize control of the company through legal manipulation and, according to documents that had only recently come to light, outright fraud. I sat in stunned silence as Mr. Harrington explained that my grandmother had spent years quietly rebuilding and protecting the company from behind the scenes, using intermediaries and trusted advisors to keep her identity separate from the business's public face, terrified that the same people who had once tried to destroy her family would come after her only granddaughter if her true identity and inheritance became known too soon. She had waited, he explained, for the right moment to reveal the truth to me, a moment she had planned to orchestrate herself once I was older and more established, but her sudden passing had left those plans unfinished, and the terms of the trust dictated that the full truth would only be revealed to me upon the birth of my first child, a safeguard she had built in, Mr. Harrington believed, to ensure I would have a family of my own, a reason to be careful and wise with what I was about to inherit, before the weight of such wealth and responsibility fell upon my shoulders. I left that office in a daze that afternoon, driving home slowly through streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar, though nothing about them had changed except everything I now understood about my own life. I did not tell anyone immediately, not even Margaret, not even my brother, needing time to sit with the enormity of what I had learned, needing to understand who I was now that the story of my own life had shifted so dramatically beneath my feet. I thought of my grandmother's hands, rough and warm and smelling of lavender, and I understood now the shadow that used to pass over her eyes whenever I asked about my parents, understood that she had been carrying an enormous weight of protection and grief and secrecy for my entire childhood, determined to give me an ordinary life for as long as she possibly could. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to me, Nathaniel's new life with Vivian was beginning to show cracks of its own, though it would be several more weeks before those cracks would fully come to light. Vivian, it turned out, was not who she claimed to be at all. She had, in fact, once worked as a personal assistant for a genuinely wealthy family before being dismissed under circumstances involving missing jewelry that were quietly settled out of court to avoid scandal, and she had spent the years since constructing an elaborate persona, borrowing the name of a real but distant and estranged branch of an actual wealthy family, forging documents and photographs, and using small loans and calculated debt to maintain the appearance of wealth long enough to attract men like Nathaniel, men ambitious and vain enough to want desperately to believe in the life she seemed to offer, men who would ask few questions as long as the illusion remained intact. She had strung along at least 2 other relationships before Nathaniel using similar tactics, always moving on before the truth could catch up with her, and Nathaniel, dazzled by her confidence and her carefully cultivated charm, had asked almost none of the questions that might have unraveled her story sooner. I gave birth to my daughter on a warm afternoon in early June, with Margaret holding my hand on one side of the hospital bed and my brother pacing anxiously in the waiting room outside, and when the nurse placed my daughter in my arms for the first time, tiny and warm and impossibly precious, I wept the kind of tears that come from a place beyond words, tears that held within them all the grief of the past months and all the fierce, overwhelming love I felt for this small person who was entirely mine to protect. I named her Elena, after my grandmother's middle name, a quiet tribute to the woman whose sacrifices I was only beginning to understand. Nathaniel did not come to the hospital. He had been informed, through my brother, that I had gone into labor, and he sent a brief, almost perfunctory text message wishing me well, a message that told me everything I needed to know about where his priorities now stood. It was 2 weeks after Elena's birth, as I sat in my small apartment nursing her in the early afternoon light, that Mr. Harrington called again, this time to formally walk me through the process of stepping into my role within the Ashworth Family Trust, now that the conditions of my grandmother's will had been satisfied. I remember feeling a strange mixture of fear and clarity as he explained the scope of what I now controlled, a controlling stake in a company worth more money than I had ever imagined possessing, along with properties and investments that had been quietly growing under careful management for decades. He explained that the news would likely become public within weeks, as the trust's terms required certain filings now that a beneficiary had been formally established, and he gently warned me to prepare myself for the attention this would bring, both welcome and unwelcome. He was right to warn me. Within a month, the story had made its way into financial news outlets and, shortly after, into more mainstream media, the quiet, previously unknown granddaughter of the reclusive Eleanor Ashworth stepping forward as the true and legal heir to one of the country's most significant privately held fortunes. I remember sitting with Elena asleep against my chest, scrolling through the articles with a strange, detached sense of unreality, as though I were reading about someone else's life entirely. It was around this same time that Vivian's carefully constructed world began to collapse in earnest, as journalists digging into the newly public Ashworth story stumbled upon her fraudulent claims to the very same family name she had been using to seduce Nathaniel and others before him, exposing the forged documents and the pattern of deception that had defined her recent years. I learned later, through mutual acquaintances and, eventually, through Nathaniel himself, how the truth had unraveled in front of him. He had proposed to Vivian only weeks after leaving me, eager to secure what he believed was his ticket into a life of wealth and status, and it was at the celebratory dinner following that proposal, surrounded by people he had hoped would soon be his new social circle, that a guest had recognized Vivian from a previous scandal and confronted her openly, exposing years of lies in a matter of minutes. Nathaniel described it to me later as the single most humiliating moment of his life, watching the woman he had left his pregnant wife for dissolve into desperate, tearful denials that only confirmed her guilt further, watching the life he had imagined for himself crumble in real time in front of strangers who had, only moments before, been toasting to his future happiness. It was, I think, the cruelest kind of irony that within the very same month Nathaniel discovered the woman he had chosen was a fraud, he also learned, through the same news cycles that were exposing Vivian, that the wife he had left behind, pregnant and grieving, was the real heiress all along, that the life of wealth and status he had gambled everything to chase had, in fact, been standing quietly in his own kitchen the entire time, wearing an apron and editing manuscripts for a modest paycheck, asking for nothing more than his faithfulness and his presence. I do not say this to suggest that wealth was ever what mattered most to me, or that Nathaniel's greatest sin was simply choosing incorrectly between two women based on money. His greatest sin, I came to understand clearly during those months, was that he had been willing to abandon his pregnant wife and unborn child for the mere idea of a better life, revealing a hollowness in his character that no amount of money, real or fake, could have ever filled. Nathaniel reached out to me for the first time in nearly 2 months on a warm afternoon in late July, asking if we could meet somewhere neutral to talk. I agonized over whether to agree, torn between the part of me still nursing a deep wound and the part of me that believed, perhaps foolishly, in the value of hearing someone out with an open heart, especially when a child's future was involved. I agreed to meet him at a small park near my apartment, choosing a public, sunlit space deliberately, wanting daylight and open air around me rather than the enclosed intimacy of a restaurant or living room. I brought Elena with me in her stroller, partly because I had no one available to watch her, but partly, I admit, because I wanted him to see clearly what he had walked away from, this small, sleeping proof of the life we had briefly built together. He looked different when I saw him that afternoon, thinner, more tired, the confident swagger that had defined him during his time with Vivian entirely gone, replaced by something more raw and uncertain. He apologized, and I believe, in that moment, his apology was genuine, though genuine remorse and genuine change are not always the same thing. He spoke about how ashamed he felt, how he had let vanity and ambition convince him that our life together was somehow not enough, how watching Vivian's deception unravel had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own choices and character. He asked, tentatively, whether there might be any possibility of us finding our way back to each other, whether I could ever find it in my heart to forgive him and consider rebuilding what we had lost. I sat with his words for a long moment, watching Elena's small chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep beside us, feeling the warm sun on my shoulders, and I found, to my own surprise, that I did not feel the surge of anger I had expected to feel. What I felt instead was something quieter and, in its own way, more powerful, a settled clarity about who I had become during these months of hardship and discovery. I told him that I forgave him, and I meant it, because I had come to understand that carrying anger and bitterness would only poison the life I was trying to build for my daughter, that forgiveness was something I needed to offer not for his sake but for my own peace and for the kind of mother I wanted to be. But I told him, just as honestly, that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing, that the trust he had broken could not simply be rebuilt because circumstances had changed, because the woman he had once dismissed as insufficient had turned out to possess the very wealth he had chased so desperately elsewhere. I told him that I needed him to understand this distinction clearly, that I would always welcome him as Elena's father, that I would never stand in the way of him loving and knowing his daughter, but that the marriage we once had was something I could not simply resurrect on the basis of his changed circumstances and belated remorse. He wept, sitting there on that park bench, and I felt a genuine sadness for him even as I held firm in my decision, because I understood that his grief was real, even if it was tangled up with regret over what he had lost materially as much as emotionally. We talked for a long while longer, working out the practical details of how he would be present in Elena's life moving forward, and when we finally parted ways that afternoon, I felt something settle within me that I can only describe as peace, the particular peace that comes from choosing yourself and your child over the comfortable narrative of a fairy tale reunion that the world might have expected from a story like this one. In the months that followed, I threw myself into understanding my new responsibilities, working closely with Mr. Harrington and the Trust's longtime advisors to learn the intricacies of the company my grandmother had spent her life quietly protecting. I discovered, as I dug deeper into the family's history, the full extent of what my grandmother had sacrificed to keep me safe and unburdened during my childhood, learning of threats made against her decades earlier by the same business rivals who had tried to seize control of the Ashworth fortune after my grandfather's death, Threats serious enough that she had chosen to raise me in obscurity rather than risk exposing me to danger before I was old enough to protect myself. Understanding this history transformed my grief over her passing into something deeper and more complex, a profound gratitude layered over profound loss, and I found myself wishing desperately that I could tell her, just once, how much I understood now. How much I honored the quiet strength it must have taken her to carry that secret for so many years while still managing to give me a childhood filled with warmth and lavender-scented bread and Sunday afternoons in the garden. I made a decision, early in my transition into this new role, that I did not want the wealth I had inherited to simply sit quietly accumulating in accounts and properties while so many people around me struggled the way I had struggled during those difficult months after Nathaniel left. I began working with Mr. Harrington and the company's board to establish a foundation, one focused specifically on supporting single mothers navigating financial hardship, offering grants for housing, childcare, and education to women who found themselves, as I once had, standing alone in a kitchen with an uncertain future stretching out ahead of them. I named the foundation after my grandmother, wanting her quiet strength and sacrifice to live on in a way that could reach beyond our own small family. And I remember the deep satisfaction I felt the day we announced the first round of grants, knowing that somewhere out there, women who felt as frightened and alone as I once had would receive a measure of the support I wished I had been given during my own darkest weeks. Margaret, who had stood by me so faithfully throughout everything, eventually came to work alongside me at the foundation, and my brother Oliver, who had always possessed a sharp mind for numbers, joined the company's board, both of them bringing a sense of familiar warmth and trust into a world that could otherwise have felt overwhelming and isolating. I found, in the months that followed, that wealth itself did not change who I fundamentally was, did not transform me into someone unrecognizable to myself, but it did give me tools and opportunities to extend the kind of care and support that had once been extended to me by the people who loved me during my hardest moments. And there was a deep meaning in that continuity that I treasured more than any material comfort the fortune provided. Vivian, for her part, faced legal consequences for the fraudulent documents she had used over the years, though the details of her eventual fate matter far less to this story than the lesson embedded within her downfall, a lesson about the emptiness of building an identity on lies and the inevitable collapse that follows when illusions are finally exposed to the light. Nathaniel, to his credit, did work to rebuild his relationship with Elena over the following years, showing up consistently for scheduled visits, working through a slow and sometimes uncomfortable process of earning back a measure of trust, not as my husband, but as our daughter's father, and I found a quiet peace in watching him grow into that more limited but meaningful role, understanding that people are capable of growth even after profound failures, even if that growth does not always lead back to the exact relationship that was broken. As Elena grew older, I found myself telling her, in gentle pieces appropriate to her age, the story of her great-grandmother's quiet strength, the story of the difficult months before her birth, the story of how our family's fortune had been protected through generations of sacrifice and love rather than simply handed down as an inheritance to be taken for granted. I wanted her to understand, from as early an age as she could grasp it, that her worth as a person had nothing to do with the wealth attached to her name, that character and kindness and integrity were the true inheritances worth protecting, and that the family she belonged to, our family, had learned this lesson through genuine hardship rather than easy comfort. There is a particular kind of healing that comes not from erasing pain but from transforming it into something that serves others, and I believe that is ultimately what this story taught me most deeply. I did not become the woman I am today despite the betrayal I experienced in that kitchen 8 months pregnant and utterly heartbroken. I became her, in many ways, because of it, because that pain forced me to discover a strength within myself I had never needed to access before, because it opened the door to a truth about my own history that I might never have fully understood otherwise, and because it taught me, in the deepest and most personal way possible, the difference between a life built on illusion and a life built on genuine substance and love. If you have made it this far with me, I want to ask you something before we reach the end of this story together, something I hope you will sit with for a moment. I would love for you to leave a comment below sharing what this story means to you, perhaps a moment in your own life when you discovered a strength you did not know you had, or a time when forgiveness helped set you free from a pain that was weighing you down, or simply what the words hope and second chances mean to you in your own journey. Our community here grows stronger every time we share these honest reflections with one another, and I read every single comment with gratitude for the people who take the time to open their hearts alongside these stories. Elena is older now, old enough to run through the garden of the home I eventually built, a home with far more warmth and grandeur despite its size, filled with the same lavender-scented bread my grandmother used to bake, a recipe I learned to make myself in the years after her passing, wanting to keep that particular thread of comfort alive for my daughter the way it had once been kept alive for me. I think often about that afternoon in the kitchen, the coffee mug still warm in my hands, the devastating certainty that my entire world was collapsing around me, and I marvel now at how little that moment, painful as it was, actually predicted about the life that would eventually unfold from it. I could not have known, standing there in my grief, that within the wreckage of that betrayal lay the seeds of a truth about my own identity, my own strength, and my own capacity for both love and boundaries that would ultimately lead me toward a life richer and more meaningful than I ever could have imagined on my own. If this story touched your heart today, I hope you will like this video, leave a meaningful comment sharing your own reflections, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder that pain is never the final chapter, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about resilience, forgiveness, and the quiet, transformative power of choosing hope even in our darkest moments. Thank you for walking through this journey with me and with our growing family of listeners here. Every heart that finds its way to healing makes this community a little brighter, and I am endlessly grateful that you chose to spend this time with us today. Until the next story, I wish you the same thing I once wished so desperately for myself during those long, uncertain months, the courage to stand steady in the truth of who you are, and the faith to believe that even after the deepest heartbreak, a beautiful new chapter is always still possible.